Bibliophiles of the internet, my name is Adri, and today I'm here to review two upcoming Dark Academia books. Towards the end of July, beginning of August, I picked up two arcs that just happened to both be relating to Dark Academia, and that both sort of reframe or challenge the concept of Dark Academia in really interesting and necessary ways. So I thought it'd be interesting to do like a deep dive on both of them and review them in the same space. I want to make it very clear that I am not putting these books in conversation with each other. Not only are they intended for very different demographics and audiences, but they're both trying to do very different things. With that said, I'm going to start with How We Fall Apart by Katie Zhao, which recently came out from Bloomsbury on August 17th. Katie Zhao is a Chinese-American author of children's fiction, and this is her YA Dark Academia thriller with an all-Asian cast set in a private school known as Sinclair Prep, where the top-ranking student named Jamie was recently found dead under very mysterious circumstances. The main character, Nancy, finds herself and her friends becoming the prime suspects in Jamie's death because this anonymous person calling themselves the Proctor has named them as such on social media and is threatening to expose each of their worst secrets until they confess. Content warnings for abuse, self-harm, violence, parental neglect, panic attacks, drug use, mental illness, inappropriate teacher-student relationship, racism, as well as suicide and suicidal thoughts. And as a point of clarity, that list of content warnings was actually written by the author and listed in the book. To kind of set the stage for both of these discussions, I think it would be helpful to start with a working definition of Dark Academia, specifically in literature, so that we can really get into it. To start off, in a very broad sense, Dark Academia stories primarily take place on school campuses, or involve school campuses to some degree, especially the private ones. Dark Academia, in my understanding, ultimately serves as an examination of power, prestige, and privilege, and aims to expose the dark underbelly of the academic system through hidden murders, mysteries, scandals, illicit relationships, dark urges, secret societies, etc., etc. Dark Academia is not a subgenre I tend to gravitate towards often. As an eclectic reader, I have read and enjoyed it before, and I'm sure I will continue to do so, but it's not my go-to genre because it's so deeply steeped in whiteness, and in a way that often further romanticizes white privilege instead of critiquing it. That's a huge part of what makes How We Fall Apart so necessary and so fascinating, because it is a purposeful reframing and reimagining of Dark Academia in a specifically Asian American context. This book challenges the positioning of whiteness as central to the genre of Dark Academia by positing that the key components of Dark Academia, exceptionalism, ego, bottomless drive, privilege, etc., are all values that are messaged by way of the model minority myth to Asian American students. I will actually link an article by Sarah Soonling Blackburn about the model minority myth if you want to learn more about it, which you should. But very generally speaking, it is the pervasive belief or expectation that minorities, especially Asian communities, are perfect, upstanding citizens who achieve astronomical amounts of success because of their natural talent and their hard-working immigrant survival tactics. This unsustainable standard of perfection is deeply toxic and contributes to often unaddressed mental health problems in Asian American demographics. Every theme in this story is written as a direct challenge to those expectations. I think this story is really commenting on how academia itself is a deeply corrupt institution that is ruled by whiteness and built upon a framework of whiteness that BIPOC people cannot access by definition. So if you want to successfully navigate academia in the US, you have to either be white or approximate yourself to whiteness. These characters have been taught that privilege and wealth are indications of power, morality, and worthiness when it comes to accessing certain opportunities and resources. The more privilege you have, the more chances you get, even if you don't deserve them. And even though this story is told through the lens of an all-Asian cast, these characters have internalized those power dynamics of white privilege and are effectively turning them back on each other and themselves. The story also questions how we understand success, who gets to decide what success means, and what we expect BIPOC communities to sacrifice in order to achieve greatness or to reach an untenable standard of success. Even the idea that successful and professional people are well educated is rooted in racism and classism. It's a lingering belief that gives credence to the idea that minority communities need to prove that we are worthy of accessing certain opportunities and spaces, and that we need to formally demonstrate that we are not inherently uncivilized or unintelligent. That need to prove themselves is so apparent by how these characters are more than willing to take Jamie's place as the top student, even though it literally led to her death. because they've been conditioned to believe that success is worth every risk and every cost. It all feeds back into this concept of elitism, which is a primary tenet of white privilege and which encourages competition over community as a form of gatekeeping to uphold this fiction that exceptionalism is something that should be or can be achieved when it can't. For these characters, elitism is a shortcut for feeling chosen or accepted, especially in a system that will always see them as second-class citizens who will never be noticed or respected unless they are exceptionally perfect. And the story also doesn't shy away from spotlighting messy, traumatized characters who are making terrible choices as a response to feeling powerless. These characters don't feel like their lives or their futures are their choice, and so their agency is their only remaining form of power, their only way of reclaiming some semblance of control and fighting back. Not only do those bad choices directly dispute the model minority myth, but they're a way for the characters to challenge those impossible expectations. Any action rebelling against those oppressive systems of authority is a forceful reclamation of their own narrative on their own terms, even if they're not making quote-unquote good choices. This one story got me to think about all of those things and then some. So when I say that I have a tremendous amount of respect for the work this story is doing and the perspectives it's attempting to share, I mean it. But with all of that said, I didn't love this story, and I'll tell you why. Thematically, structurally, this story is doing so much great stuff. It's a powerful social commentary, it's intense, it's fast-paced, it has this ticking time bomb sort of plot device. I love those things. But the characters and character dynamics are disproportionately lacking in depth to support the story in the way that it needs. I think all of these characters are fascinating, messy, and complex, but we don't really get a chance to get to know them or to understand why they make the choices they make. As I said in the synopsis, these characters have secrets that are potentially going to be exposed, and even though that's an interesting plot device that makes the story feel intense, sadly we don't really get to know anything more about the characters outside of those secrets. I want to be very intentional in saying that there's nothing wrong with having characters who make bad choices, because especially in awful circumstances, not all choices are rooted in logic. I don't need those choices to be justified in any way, but I would like a stronger sense of the people making those choices. And that feeds into my larger issue with the story in that the drama and the tension feel surface level to me because there are no long-lasting consequences for these characters' actions. And again, for the sake of clarity, consequences doesn't always mean punishment, but rather some kind of natural result, response, reaction, or impact that stems from their choices. The secrets in question are no joke. We're talking some serious allegations like drug use, illicit relationships, crimes, involuntary manslaughter, and these are secrets that the characters have kept from even their closest friends. And yet, when those secrets come to light, their relationships remain virtually unchanged. Part of the problem is that we're told that they're friends, even best friends, and yet they don't feel emotionally connected to each other, and there's little to no textual evidence to back up that claim. So regardless of the intention there, it was hard for me to feel invested in the emotional component of the story, and because there are no emotional consequences in this friend group, it was hard for me to take those reveals seriously and not just feel like they were purely for shock value and nothing else. Ultimately, I think the problem is that while intense things are happening on the surface, the tension doesn't feel like it's actually rooted in real-world stakes, and that's why I didn't feel connected to it. But even with that in mind, I still have a tremendous amount of respect for the work this story is doing and what it's trying to accomplish. I just think it's a classic case of concept and themes being stronger than characters and execution. I still think it's absolutely worth the read, and with that said, I gave it a solid 3.5 stars. The second Dark Academia book I picked up was Summer Suns by Lee Mandello, which comes out on September 18th from Tor.com. And I do want to clarify, even though it's being published by Tor.com, it is a full-length book. Lee Mandello is a gender nonconforming, genderqueer author, and this is their debut book that was pitched as The Secret History meets The Fast and the Furious with a side of vengeful queer ghosts. And if that sounds like a great pitch, it's because it is. It's about two best friends, Andrew and Eddie, who are planning on starting a graduate program together in Nashville. And the day before Andrew is going to join Eddie at Vanderbilt, Eddie is pronounced to be dead by his own hand. At least that's what everyone suspects, but Andrew is convinced that his best friend slash almost boyfriend was actually killed. Now he's inherited Eddie's fortune, his roommates, his classes, and unfinished research on Southern ghost stories, and also the gruesome phantom of Eddie himself, who is hell-bent on revenge and violence. Content warnings for death and grief brief mentions of suicide and self-harm, blood, gore, vomit, graphic injury and graphic violence, drug use and driving while intoxicated, homophobic slurs, a brief reference to child abuse, and some graphic sexual content. So the whole Secret History meets Fast and Furious thing is pretty accurate to some extent, but in reality, this story is a profound and visceral exploration of toxic masculinity and the inherently violent tradition of whiteness. As I said before, dark academia is a genre that explores the corrupt underbelly of academic institutions, privilege, and excessive wealth. And when we're talking about dark academia stories set in the US, that disproportionate privilege and power is inherently tied to whiteness, and yet few dark academia stories actually examine those implications. This story stands apart in that it understands how those institutions and that kind of power lay the groundwork for toxic white men especially to manipulate their way to success, and it throws the reader into this messy, chaotic, traumatized, reckless group of characters and names their toxicity for what it is. And I do want to point out that while it's not really reckoning with the indisputable fact that the specific kinds of generational wealth and privilege that are sanctioned and upheld by academia are built off of the suffering and labor of marginalized communities, there is an acknowledgement of that in the story, which is more than most dark academia stories tend to do. But like I said, this story is more of a commentary on toxic masculinity, especially white masculinity, which is what tends to trickle down and affect all of us. Again, working definitions are helpful here, so toxic masculinity is, at its core, a perpetuation of loneliness, isolation, emotional illiteracy, distance, avoidance, disassociation, and detachment. Not only are these ideals and practices preserved in the tradition of whiteness, but they are bartered by men and masculine identifying people in exchange for access to power and space. And more importantly, toxic masculinity manifests itself in very specific ways in queer men, and most dangerously in white queer men who can levy their relative marginalization as a justification for perpetuating toxicity, harm, and violence. Summer Sons effectively examines how toxic masculinity has infected these characters to the point of literally haunting and possessing some of them, and then pushing them to the breaking point to see just how far they're willing to run to avoid their problems. And let me tell you, it is quite a long ways. The spirits in this story are called revenants. They feed off of and grow stronger from blood and violence, and they clearly represent the deadly hold that trauma has on Andrew's life and choices. As the revenant gains power, it begins to claim more of Andrew's body, energy, agency, and awareness, and this terrifies Andrew because, let's just say it, giving up power or control in any sense is a white man's worst nightmare. There's a strong commentary on the willful assimilation into toxic masculinity, into aggression and violence and isolation in exchange for acceptance, which is really conditional acceptance. Everyone around Andrew knows about the revenants. They know he's being haunted by Eddie. They know that he and Eddie had unresolved feelings for each other. It's obvious, and yet Andrew still goes to great lengths to try and hide it, and also to avoid talking about it. Not only is that indicative of the raging internalized homophobia Andrew is wielding against himself, but it really speaks to how men and masculine identifying people embody the messaging that to ask for help is equivalent to weakness. It's important to understand that whiteness, as it manifests in America, is not a culture, it's not an ethnic group, it's not a unifying identity that is conducive to community. And that lack of community that keeps men and masculine identifying people isolated from each other and from everyone is the true weakness. I was thinking about that a lot because when I first picked up this book, I was listening to Alok Vaimanand's episode on the Man Enough podcast, which I will actually link down below, and everyone who can access it should access it because it is essential in every sense of the word. I have the clip, but I don't know if including it will actually give me a copyright strike. So even though I am not going to deliver this with the power that they can, I am going to quote you what they said. So they said, "This is the collateral that men are told to pay. Keep quiet, don't sensitize yourself to anything, shut up, don't have a personality beyond what is marketed to you, don't display any vulnerability, and you are going to get power. But that kind of power is loneliness." White cis straight men don't have community. They have hyper isolation and they have hyper disassociation that they mistake as personality. In relinquishing the false project of power, people are allowed to be vulnerable, and vulnerability is the basis of community. The chafing of those sensibilities is part of what makes this story so fascinating, because there's an irony to how Andrew suddenly finds himself in what would seem like a community of Eddie's university friends who have these set dynamics and traditions, and yet he's more alone than he's ever felt. The framework for community, or at the very least friendship, is there, and yet he insists on separating himself further and making himself be alone so that he doesn't have to relinquish any power within the group by marking himself as different or weak. Andrew's only able to start making any progress, both emotionally and in terms of figuring out what happened to Eddie, once he starts opening up and actually giving people a chance to see what he's really going through and who he really is. And that's a powerful message. And when you think about it, ghost stories are really about finding peace, about releasing the spirit, helping them move on, addressing their unfinished business, that kind of stuff, which feels even more profound when you think about how these revenants represent these cycles of trauma, toxicity, abuse, and violence. In solving this mystery and disappearing this revenant, you essentially have a character who says, I will not let this control my life. I have to let go of the things that are hurting me if I want to survive, and I know there's a better way of living than this. I'm also interested in how the story again explores the underbelly of toxic masculinity by reveling in the dark, twisted, complicated, deeply rich emotional landscape that Andrew keeps locked away inside. The irony is that he's dealing with a lot of emotions beneath the surface. He's dealing with grief, mental health, unrequited love, fear, internalized homophobia, and uncertainty, and the story just really lives in that angst. And ultimately that emotion comes to the surface and leads the story towards a place of hopefulness for masculine relationships, because the characters are more open and honest with each other by the end, and they are made stronger because of it, even though they still may be imperfect. With all of that said, there were a couple of minor things that kept this from being a 5-star book for me personally. The first thing was the pacing of the story, specifically when it comes to how the mystery itself develops and unfolds. What I love about this story is that it's so deeply visceral and aesthetic. It is a dark, queer Southern Gothic, and it just lives in that zone in a way that's very unapologetic. But the problem is, at times, it feels like the mystery, which is the central conflict, gets a bit lost. After I had gotten past the halfway point, I realized that I didn't know anything more about Eddie's death or potential killer that I didn't already know from the synopsis or the first 20 pages of the book. It takes a very long time for Andrew to start piecing everything together and making some headway in learning about what Eddie had gotten himself into, which made me question where the story was going at times. And I think another part of that is that the world building elements could have been incorporated a little bit better, specifically with the Revenants. Their origins and the way they're connected to Andrew and Eddie isn't revealed until almost the end of the book. I think the narrative could have benefited from having that information come in earlier, because that also contributed to my confusion about the mechanics of Revenants. What triggers them? What do they want? How do you break their hold on you? And what are their limits? Every time a Revenant pops up, the rules are just ever so slightly different, so I wish there was a little more clarity, a little more definition to how that works. But those things are not really deal breakers for me, so to speak. I still had a very visceral, powerful response to this story, and I think thematically and aesthetically, it's a fucking goldmine of quality content. I can say with confidence that this book will come to mind years from now when I look back on my reading in 2021, and that's really saying something. I enjoyed it so much, and I gave it 4.5 stars. In the comments down below, tell me about the last Dark Academia book that you read, or let me know if you plan on picking up either of these 2 books. But that is everything I had to share with you for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.